Hello, and welcome to Further Afield, a project which discusses and explores art and disability in rural spaces. My name is Bella Milroy. I'm a disabled artist based in my hometown of Chesterfield, North Derbyshire. And Further Afield is a project produced in collaboration between myself and Level Centre, who are a rurally based Arts Council England national portfolio organisation in Roseley, Derbyshire, just down the road from me. The project consists of a series of interviews with disabled artists, as well as research into the experiences of disabled artists in rural settings. It seeks to promote their work and learn about ways of making and producing art that aren't always offered the space or recognition that it deserves. All Further Afield interviews are available to watch on the Level Centre website, and an audio podcast version will also be available to listen to. There will be transcripts of all conversations. Go to levelcentre.com for more information about the project, access, and the contributing artists. Further Afield is a project supported by Arts Council England, Level Centre, Shape Arts, Derbyshire Libraries, Harlem Art Space, Arts Derbyshire, and Wising Arts Centre. My pronouns are she, her, and for my visual description, I'm a white woman in my early 30s with an oval face and round cheeks. I have pale white skin with short brown hair and round glasses. I'm also working from home, where behind me there's a grey sofa, a lamp, some cushions, and a stack of shelves and drawers in the background. There may also be some dogs and a cat wandering around from time to time. So today with me, I have Letty McHugh, who is a brilliant artist and writer based in Haworth, West Yorkshire. Letty's work explores the universality of personal experience, which, and I quote, is basically the intellectual way of saying she's interested in people, their stories, and the things that connect us all. At the moment, she is researching ways of making work to bring connection and solace to people experiencing isolation, drawing inspiration from her own experiences of living with a chronic illness. In 2022, Letty was an associate artist with Disability Arts Online and fellow with Dada Fest. Her book, Book of Hours, a collection of poetry and lyric essays, was launched at the Leeds Playhouse in June 2022. It recently won the Barbellion Prize, and I have it here with me for those listening on podcast form. I have it in my hands. It's wonderful. Go and read it. Couldn't recommend more. And yeah, that's kind of my introduction. That's everything from me. So Letty, welcome. Thank you for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. Do you want me to do a visual description of
That
myself?
would be great. Yeah.
So I'm Letty. I'm a early 30s white woman with red hair and a bob. I'm wearing two different types of leopard print, one on my head, one on a scarf, and some sunglasses because I have light sensitivity. Behind me, you can see a desk, a cactus with a fungal infection, and some like notice boards and a fan.
Oh, amazing. The cactus with a fungal infection was a highlight for me. It's great.
Well, you wouldn't have known otherwise.
Thank you so much. Maybe we can just kick off the conversation today. You can just tell us a little bit about your work, tell us a little bit about where you're based and what you're up to at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a visual artist and a writer. I'm based here in beautiful Haworth in West Yorkshire. I'm working on a couple of different projects. It's really, this year's been about discovering what you can do from an armchair in your house, which turns out is quite a lot because we have the wonder of the internet. But I think that fits out quite well with what we're talking about. And as you mentioned in my description, I'm interested in finding ways that art can bring connection when we are more isolated, either through illness or where we live or like whatever the reason might be. I think that's really something that interests me because I find a lot of connection through visual arts, but obviously I'm often unable to get into an art gallery. So I'm really interested in finding ways to make work that can be accessed through the internet, basically, or through I guess a book is something you can read and how you can have connection without having to be together, so you can connect with people without having to be in the same room, is what I'm interested in at the moment.
That was so nice. I wanted to jump in at so many points, but like, yes, that's so great. I mean, yeah, the idea of stretching the possibilities of making from an armchair is just endlessly inspiring to me, and amongst the frustrations and confines of that as well, it's such interesting tension and dynamic to exist in making. I think it's a really wonderful thing to explore. So I'm really excited to kind of share more around that in this conversation, and also really lovely to hear about kind of wanting to challenge the different ways in which art is experienced, and kind of trying to decentralize a gallery context in that way, I think is really a really brilliant approach. It was lovely.
Yeah. I realised, I'll just say this is a disclaimer, that part of what's going to be difficult for me about recording a podcast is that my instinct to kind of jump and talk at the same time as people. So I'm trying to resist that urge, but I apologise in advance.
Oh no, feel free. This is both paces are welcomed. This is totally fine. Yeah, so whenever you want to jump in, please do.
But I just wanted to pick up on that gallery thing is really interesting to me at the minute, because I really want to make work that can be in art galleries.
Yes.
I'm aware that it's not always something that's accessible to me. And with my recent project Anchorage, where I made a large scale installation, I really didn't want to make I'd kind of made this vow that I wasn't going to make any more large scale textile installations. And then I had the idea and I was like, oh no, I love this idea. But trying to work with that and find ways, I kind of made some videos to go with that project that could live online. But I recently had this revelation that I kind of think of art through companion books. I always think about Book of Hours started life as a companion book to Anchorage.
Yes, it's so clear from looking on your website, and the CV is really clear of just like there's art and then there's companion book, art and companion book. It's a lovely pattern.
And I kind of had this revelation that the reason I do that, after I'd shown Anchorage in a gallery, because it was kind of my first opportunity to have a gallery show of any length, it was open for like 3 months, was that when I was accessing work as a teenager and then again as a chronically ill adult, it was always in libraries. Like I was reading Sophie Calle, I wasn't going to an exhibition, I was seeing it as companion books, or I was reading about like Tracy Emin's back catalogue through books. And I had this thing that's the way I think about art, because most of the time I'm not accessing art in galleries, I'm reading the exhibition guide at home.
Wow, that's such a lovely kind of way of finding connection with art in a meaningful way that doesn't require your body's physical presence in that centered space, maybe we could I think that was like the first kind of point I wanted to discuss with you, was around isolation, because as you've already just discussed there, much of your work explores aspects of isolation within sick and disabled experiences. And so just going on from there, one of that being one approach of finding a medium like a book as a way of translating that. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how that intersects with your geographic location? Like, does living rurally compound isolation or support it, or is that sometimes or both? Maybe talk a bit about that. Sure.
So I think it's quite an interesting one, because definitely I ended up living back rurally because I have MS. Like if I didn't have MS, I would have loved to move to London. Or like the glamorous things you want to do when you're 19 and live in the big city. But at the same time, it's also, I moved back here because this is where I have a community. I have a huge family, and they are mostly still living in and around the Worth Valley where I live. So there is a lot of connection for me here as well. But definitely just practical stuff that people don't think about, like the fact that the last bus is at 7:15 when you live in a rural place. And I living independently now, but for a long time I was back at my mum and dad's, and they live really rurally, and there's no pavement, so you can't go out and meet people and then walk home even, because it's not safe.
Yeah.
So there's quite a lot of practical considerations that do, I think, especially when I was younger, I felt quite isolated from, I think, my peer group, so people in a similar age to me. And sometimes it is just because of your illness, you would be isolated wherever you lived. So definitely one of the, I feel weird using the word inspiration because it was rubbish, but like the inspiration for Book of Hours was that I had this flare up of my chronic illness, and I struggled quite a lot with light sensitivity. So I had like quite an extreme episode of photophobia, where I had to be in the room with the curtains shut, and that would have been the same wherever I lived. But it became then, I think I became really interested in, I looked through that project at quite a lot of like hermits and anchoresses and people who had isolated themselves on purpose, because I became obsessed with this idea that they would have this secret of like, this is how you do isolation well, so it doesn't feel rubbish anymore. Because they had done it on purpose and I was having to do it because of my illness.
Almost kind of like like finding a kind of virtual autonomy through their choice to be isolated versus your being submitted to isolation.
Yeah, exactly. Like they have the secret to how I guess it was like to how to not feel sad because you're stuck in the room by yourself.
That's a really good core explanation of that, for sure.
But as I started the research, I became really interested in this idea that also the modern people who do what hermits did are all artists. So it was people like Agnes Martin, who went out into the desert famously and basically made a modern hermitage. And I became quite interested in this link between, which I certainly feel, this kind of push-pull as artists of like, I need to be alone. Oh, I need to be surrounded by people. And definitely being rural helps for when you want to like go alone and have a walk in the woods or be alone in the moors and like think dramatic thoughts. I used to spend quite a lot of time as a teenager. Like I used to wear this velvet cape that I used to wear and like walk on the moors and read the Brontes and read Sylvia Plath and like,
oh my god, amazing.
It was a really good location to have teenage angst. But then there is also the kind of less romantic area of just like, I would like to go somewhere and there's not a bus for 2 hours.
And I think those kinds of like very kind of hard boundaries of practical things, particularly within disabled context, just like you say, just like simply not having pavements, like that's you can't nice your way out of that. You can't like unsad yourself from that,
Yeah, exactly. Just that's a kind of hard, that you have to deal with. But again, like I lived for 4 years in Bath, which is like not a proper city. It is a city, but it's not like a big city. And I really wanted to then move to London or move to Bristol, and I really yearned for that city experience, but I've never done it. So I think the way that people kind of, for me, living here feels like sometimes romanticize the countryside. I can be a bit guilty of romanticizing, like all my problems would be solved if I lived in the middle of a big city.
I think one of the things that I really struggle with. And just for viewers and listeners reference, I'm based, as I've said before, I'm based in Chesterfield, and whilst Chesterfield isn't technically a rural town, I would describe it as like rural adjacent, so it's on the edge of the Peak District. In terms of the creative network that exists locally, it is very much connected to the rural spaces that surround the town, and the rest of Derbyshire. It's definitely always a really challenging thing to think about when I think about myself in like another space. And I similarly, like you, I came back to Chesterfield when I got sick as well, and so that kind of that hunt for an autonomous decision to be here is always really kind of very much in the background consistently. And I often kind of wonder about what that would be like to be in a city, and I often just kind of comes down to it being, like you say, but I'd be sick and I just would FOMO be a million times worse because it's right there, it's all on your doorstep, but you still can't access it. Whereas again, there's a kind of practicality aspect of it here that just removes FOMO for me in a lot of ways. And I don't know if that's just me or what, but I definitely kind of it's always a really hard one to wrap my head around, of like you say, where choice lies amongst it, and the what ifs of what a different way of being would be if you lived in a different place of different infrastructure, you know.
Yes, for sure. And there's definitely I thought like 5 different thoughts there that all kind of floated away. But there's definitely, I always have this thing of like the life healthy Letty would have lived. She's like my nemesis, you know, when you play a video game and you have to like fight the shadow version of yourself. There's always like nothing goes wrong in healthy Letty's life.
Yeah,
she's just like living in London and crushing it, and none of the bad things, you know, of like being skin. Oh, like I know, you know.
Yeah.
People who lived in London and they've had rats and all this grim stuff, and like
it's just fine.
That never happens to Healthy.
No.
She's just like having a great time. But I definitely think it's got easier as I've got older.
Yeah,
because the things you want change. So it's a lot harder to be 22 and living back at my mum and dad's and not, you know, like you said, that FOMO, that kind of looking on Instagram and all your mates are having like glamorous nights out.
Yeah.
Than it is to be approaching 32 and kind of feeling more settled and more comfortable in who I am and all that sort of thing. I mean, it's easier to be grateful, I think, for the stuff. Like, even though it was really hard, I feel really grateful for the fact that, like, I have seen my grandparents who I'm close to every week for the last decade. And, you know, that's the thing to feel grateful for, that I've had that relationship as an adult with my grandparents that not a lot of people get to have.
Yeah. That you might not otherwise have had in that way.
Yeah, and I've become, so the nearest big town to me is Keighley, which again is probably kind of similar. It's not technically rural, but it's kind of a post-industrial town. And it has some problems and it has some great things about it. And when I was a teenager, I hated it. And I've become now such like a unexpectedly such a civic booster and like defender of Keighley.
Yes.
And it kind of gives you that, you know, because my 5 generations of my family lived in the same street that I was born in.
Wow.
Keighley. And to have that kind of relationship, you know, that sense of place and sense of identity and sense of who I am that makes sense here.
Yeah.
And it's also weirdly, it's like, if you are still living here in your 20s, everybody thinks your life has gone wrong, but people are starting to move home in their 30s for normal reasons.
Yeah, and I guess that's another way of like bolstering that kind of like sense of autonomy and choice around where you live, and maybe autonomy around that kind of isn't a straightforward singular decision, and it's something that just kind of evolves as you grow into a place and learn to find the things that are supportive and are joyful, you know.
Yeah, and you can only live the life you have.
Yeah, true. Very true. Oh, this is really interesting, Letty. Thank you so much. I think maybe I'd like to ask another question, So I was really excited to talk to you in particular about the nature of living in a place that has such an overwhelming historic legacy of being Bronte country. And I was really drawn to a particular piece of work of yours with that title, in which you explore living in Haworth, where the Bronte sisters live. For viewers and listeners, that's where they lived, and the heart of that legacy. And like you say, the romance of that work really remains. And I really felt like what you explored in that film highlights so much about what I want these discussions in Further Afield series to be about. So in it, you talk about that tension between the history of a place and how it exists, and then how it's actually experienced in a contemporary sense by those who live there. How do you feel about how the history and the fame of your particular location impacts the way you make and how your making is perceived? Like, what do you feel about that particular legacy of how this place sits within a contemporary art scene? Does it support or stifle? Thoughts? What do you think about that?
Thoughts. It's quite interesting. Definitely, there is like a weight to it being the hometown of the Bronte sisters, and like that's inescapable. If you live here in the West Valley, that's inescapable, you know, because like the taxi firm is called Bronte Taxis.
Yeah.
And the curry place is called Bronte Balti Curry House. You can order a Bronte Nag Balti, which is really nice if you and there's like Bronte biscuits and Bronte gin and Bronte beer. And you know, you had that relationship with them before you know, like I can remember being 5 years old and they're talking about it at school. And I sometimes would get that, you know, when there's like somebody who was in your class at school who's done really well and you're not doing that well and you're kind of unhealthily jealous of them, or like you get that Instagram jealousy, except my Instagram girl was Charlotte Bronte.
That's such a good way of putting it.
How famous do I have to get? How successful do I have to be as a writer for them to rename it Letty McHugh country?
Oh my God. I literally felt a bit of chills there. That was a really, really good analogy. Yeah.
It's never happening. But I think then, yeah, so it's definitely, you're aware of it. And you're also aware that there is kind of this, what the local art scene is a lot of like landscape paintings for self-tourists, which there's some really beautiful, I mean, valid, like but that's very much not what I do.
Yeah.
And it was quite frustrating, especially as a younger artist, when you get all that career advice of like, oh, it's easy, just put on an exhibition with your mates at the local art centre. And you know, it's like, well, where, how, who?
Yeah.
But definitely there is, like, the Bronte parsonage have which is the Bronte home. I shouldn't say that, just assuming that everybody knows what the they have a really interesting contemporary arts program. So it does kind of punch above its weight a bit culturally as well for like a tiny West Yorkshire village. And like they have the Women's Writing Festival now, but there's also a lot of weirdness which is what in that film Bronte Country, what I wanted to talk about, that like tourists don't necessarily know about and people want to ignore. And there's kind of there was at the height of industry, there was like a ton of mills. I don't know how many, but like 6 or 7 that I can think of in Haworth. That, you know, people don't know about that. And it's quite interesting. People have this like you said, romanticized view. And I think this romanticized view of the Brontes, that, as you know, living here, just some of it's not true. You spend your life perpetually. So there's like this story about Emily Bronte walking across the moors to get Branwell out of the Black Bull, which was like the local pub that he frequented.
Yeah.
And of course, living here, you know that it's not a like long walk across the romantic moors. It's like 5 steps away from where the church is. And it's just, there's all this weird stuff that like, so because there's this thing called the Bronte Vintage Vehicle Gathering, which is a gathering of tractors that weren't invented when the Brontes were alive. And there's just all this, this weirdness that maybe the people who have more literary minded kind of want to ignore, that I think is a shame, because it's part of what makes this place great, is that it's also quite a weird place and quite
almost once. Sorry, you go.
No, sorry. This is me.
Almost kind of wanting to like boost the ordinariness of it, you know, the kind of like what the, I mean, when they were there, you know, there would have just been like lots of ordinary things and lots of just odd stuff happening. It wasn't this kind of hub of creative stuff happening. That is right to say, isn't it, that it wasn't, you know?
Yeah, and there was a lot of, there was a lot of poverty, and there was a lot of this is everybody who lives in Haworth has a tenuous connection to the Brontes, which is one of the things. But so one of my sort of distant relatives was fined for keeping pigs in the cellar by the Board of Health that Patrick Bronte set up.
Oh wow, that is really, really tenuous, but very, very fun anecdote to share. Definitely.
But that's because there's always there's this sort of, I think, because if you compare them to Jane Austen, there's this sort of I can't think of the word, this idea that the Brontes kind of lived in relative poverty, which they did if you compare them to, like I say, to Jane Austen or to somebody. But compared to my family who were in Haworth then, they were having a pretty good time. And it's just quite interesting, this kind of the tension between what people want to imagine Haworth is like then, Haworth is like now, and how it really is.
Yes. The fiction of that. And it's kind of, I think that the place that exists is cooler than what people imagine. Tell me about that. Beyond Bronte tractors and that, you know, tell me what makes that feel cooler in that way.
I just think there's like a realness that people miss out on when they're kind of just imagining. And I think everyone here is really chatty and really friendly. But maybe not in the way that you would expect. It's kind of in quite a Yorkshire. I had my COVID booster the other week, and when I was putting my shirt back on, it got all twisted up. And this lady just came and she's like, "Oh, love, let me sort your shirt out for you. You're all twisted." And it's like just like that all the time. Like, people are just quite approachable, but there's also kind of quite a sense of humor that people don't necessarily. I'm thinking of people will make a joke and get involved. I love that. And it's also just, there's stuff, I don't know, I can't finish that sentence, but it's just, and there's the kind of, like I said, there's a lot of empty mills, and there's like a scrapyard people ignore, and it's just, there is this separation between the lives of people who live here, who are just living kind of normal lives, and what people want to imagine.
And in terms of like your making, do you ever feel like you are either given the opportunity to position yourself as someone who is based in that setting, someone who lives rurally, someone who lives in that kind of that place with such a legacy like that, or is that never, does that never happen? Is that never acknowledged? Or are you pigeonholed by that? You know, do you ever get like positioned into like expected to be someone from Haworth who knows everything about Bronte stuff? Or
so I think it's quite interesting. For me, the sense of humor that is in my work is very much the sense of humor that comes from this place. And that's always quite interesting to me, because people talk about like the Brontes being shaped by the landscape, and that being why they're kind of writing these romantic Gothic novels. And then, I'm also shaped by this landscape, and I'm kind of making jokes about my cat. But yeah, and definitely. So I was once, as a favor for somebody new, somebody asked me if they could interview me as an expert on Bronte pets. And it's kind of still out, and it's really easy to be an expert on Bronte pets because there's like 4 original sources where they talk about the Bronte pets. So you can like, this is my gift to you. You can be an expert in an afternoon. But this person was like a journalism student that interviewed me. And if you Google, it used to be, if you Googled Letty McHugh Bronte pets, this interview would still come up. And it was like really taken out of context. And it's like, Emily Bronte's dark history of animal abuse, says Bronte pet expert Letty McHugh. Because like there's this story of that they had this big dog and it got into a fight, and Emily Bronte came out and like threw pepper on the dogs to make them split up.
Oh wow. Amazing.
So there is that when that's why I laughed when you said pigeonholed, thinking you're going to know everything about the Brontes. Because you are speaking to Bronte pet expert.
I had no idea. Oh my god. In the presence of such knowledge. But yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, so I wonder, like, does we are approaching halfway through, but maybe I'll just follow up just quickly whilst we're still talking about this particular section. Just do you ever feel like you'd like to have the opportunity to it's always a really hard tension, isn't it, as disabled people who make art, some people embracing an identity of a disabled artist, and some people not, and that being something that's really flexible for lots of people, and there's being no right or wrong way around that. And I guess there's similarities in terms of like, if you are I wonder if there's aspects of this where you'd be curious to have more opportunity to make about the context in which you live, and you're, like you're saying, being shaped by the moors and making work around your cat. I think would you relish more opportunity to be able to take up more room in that particular aspect of your experience and identity?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm working on a commission at the minute from the Bronte Parsonage, so it's kind of
wow,
the front of my mind that I'm thinking about. But also I have a lot to say about it because it's like a lifetime of working up bits.
Yeah.
Of like, I think it's really important that we hear from people who can give us the actual view, like wherever it is, and like a more realistic view of the countryside.
Yeah.
Or like what we imagine. I know that this is off topic, but I know that this kind of campaign where people who live on the Isle of Skye are getting really frustrated by people coming to the Isle of Skye to have a spiritual experience, then writing about it and then leaving.
Yeah.
And I think, it's just good to hear from people who have a different view of a place, and I feel like I've got a lot to say about it.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
It's hard to put me up.
I mean, that's wonderful that the Bronte Passage are engaging with you. It kind of feels like that's wonderful, but also it feels so obviously important that they should be doing that with you, someone who is making in ways that are different from a standard expectation of the kind of art that would be produced there. And that kind of feels like both great that is happening, and also like, yes, that should be happening. But I think that's important to say in terms of, and I think that's also important to reflect upon in terms of these kinds of conversations where, I know I've had experiences where things come up locally and it's like, oh my god, that's like really, and if it's something that's really, really, really wonderful and exciting, and that's really brilliant, and also it shouldn't feel so few and far between that is something that matches your way of making, the diversity of your making, the diverse nature of what you produce. I think it's a shame that so often, more often than not, things that occur locally like that are not as frequent in that way.
Yeah, but I think that feeds into the fact that for so many people, you feel like if you want a career in the arts, you have to leave your rural hometown. So then there's not artists with this kind of perspective and the relationship that maybe we have, because they've all gone to London because they could.
Yeah.
So, there's not necessarily this wealth of people.
And that's like across experience as well, right? For rural places, that's like not exclusive to creative industries, right? That's something that's like a really that happens, that kind of departure of people to where work is and opportunities
and has been for a really long time.
Yeah. Oh, that's really fascinating to talk about in this context. Thank you so much. Okay, so we were just we've been talking a bit about your work and kind of your experience of working and making in Haworth, and you touched upon at one point the kinds of work, so the kinds of art that is expected to be in rural spaces like that, like landscape paintings. And I'm really interested, as part of these conversations, is exploring the narrative of rural spaces, not just within kind of the context of where you are in Haworth in terms of that legacy of kind of an overwhelming legacy of creative history there, but also in the kind of, like I say, the expectations of the kind of art that is made there. So it's, majority kind of contemporary craft and landscape paintings, quite a lot of kind of commercial making, and again, just as you said, there's absolutely nothing wrong with any of that. It's more wanting to try and kind of push beyond that, of what else could be made and how can we make more room for other kinds of art and making, and not just the art itself but the artists as well. I think that's particularly important within this context around disabled artists, but in general, I kind of wanted to explore with you about what you thought around what the impact of the wider art world failing to recognise the diversity of art and artists in rural spaces is. So, like, what is the impact of that narrow expectation that if you live rurally and you're an artist, you make landscape paintings? What do you think about that?
I think it's even more than that in, like, let's say the London art world, but like art scenes in big cities. It's not even that they think we're all going to be landscape painters. It's that they don't even know we exist. They just assume that, like, if you're gonna access the arts and you're gonna have a career in the arts, you're gonna have to move to London, or you're gonna have to move, even, like, for me, Leeds is the big city. And sometimes when, so I have been to arts events in Leeds and gone to like had opportunities in and around Leeds, and there's just the fact that it takes you I always say it takes me 20 minutes to get to Leeds because that's how long it takes me to get there from Keighley station, but it's actually like an hour because I have to leave my house, get the bus, get to the station, and you always kind of cut that bit of the journey out. But it can be quite clicky, and it's everybody assumes or you must know, whoever it is. I wanted to say Samantha Jones, but obviously she's Sex in the City, but I made up now. There is just that kind of like, oh well, you must not exist. They don't even know about us. They don't even know about the world beyond their particular city, I think. That's how it feels from my perspective.
So it's almost kind of like the narrative isn't even considered because it's you're not seen to exist there.
Yes.
Yeah. And do you feel a sense of wanting to be seen to exist there, or do you feel like there's a tension around needing to slot into their way of being a part of creative stuff happening? Do you want to like kind of push back against that directly in that way?
I think I've been in both spaces.
Yeah.
Especially you know, just I always say early in my art career as though I'm not still early in my art career. About, like 3 years ago. But like when I was first looking, or I first started getting funding opportunities in like 2019, which isn't that long ago, but feels like ages ago to me. I felt that need to kind of hide the fact that I was from, living in Haworth. So I would always say West Yorkshire based, and some of that's because people don't know where Haworth is.
Yeah.
But yeah, that kind of, because you were worried about people not wanting to give you opportunities because they kind of make that decision for you, although they're not going to want to come in. And then definitely partially it's been that my health has changed, that makes traveling more complicated. And for me, weirdly, the pandemic briefly made things easier when everything went online.
Yes.
In that one specific sense of suddenly there was all these opportunities that were hybrid events, or not even hybrid events then, whether they were like online events.
Yeah.
So you could access all of this stuff that before you would have had to travel 2 hours, which for me would have meant getting a hotel room if I was going to be productive the next day.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I've definitely, and now I just feel like, well, like I said at the beginning of the call, I am where I am, and you can do a lot from an armchair in Haworth. And if people aren't going to adapt to that, then I'm just gonna have to find other people to work with and other people to connect with.
Yeah. And do you feel like you find that where you are based? Do you feel like there is room for creative networks that exist where you live that are different from a perceived expectation of that making being landscape paintings? Like, who are the other people that you do you find that challenging, or is that actually there's a real presence of other people that want to make like in similar ways or want to connect with art in similar ways to you?
I think
does that matter to you? I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It has kind of changed for me, where I think definitely when I was younger I thought you needed art friends who made the exact same type of art as you. Whereas I do have some really good mates now who are landscape painters, and they make really good and interesting work. I think actually if they could be on this call, they would really stick up for landscape painters. Where they're doing like really interesting things and things you wouldn't expect. So I think there's also like but also just there's also this thing that comes from me, maybe, of like, because I'm not a painter at all, of like maybe I have a set of assumptions sometimes about what landscape painting is, where there's all this kind of new and interesting and creative things that people are doing with that. It's also been a really interesting time. I moved home in 2012, so like 10 years, nearly 11 years. And things have really changed recently because Bradford 2025 City of Culture is happening.
Oh, wow.
And Haworth is part of the Bradford district.
Right.
The year of culture is for the whole district.
Right.
So in the last 2 or 3 years, there's started to be opportunities that didn't exist before. So something I used to come up against a lot was there would be opportunities for northern artists, air quotes for the listeners. And then you'd look into it and they'd be like for specific postcodes in and around Manchester, or specific postcodes in and around Leeds. And the Bradford district was almost always excluded from that.
Yeah, I mean, I have lots of feelings around being someone who is North Derbyshire, but the postcode is like on the cusp of those northern artist opportunities like that. We could talk a lot about that, I think.
Yeah, and I know for sure that, like, as I've got more experienced, people have said, oh, well, yeah, but if you just email, but how are you supposed to know that when it says on their website you're not allowed to apply?
And sometimes I've done that. I've emailed about that, and they've gone, it's literally a marker of our funding. Like, we're not allowed to fund people who don't live in this zone.
Postcode. So it used to be like a major frustration that there was never anything for the Bradford district, because we're not Leeds or Manchester.
Right.
And then with the City of Culture bid, there started to be stuff for Bradford-based artists.
Wow, cool.
And that's how I ended up making. So I made last year what ended up being, didn't start out intended to be a one-woman show called Fishing Net Soul, which is about sort of the Viking heritage of this area. And it was inspired by this idea that one of the genes that potentially causes MS was spread around the world by the Vikings.
Oh, wow.
And that ended up happening because I saw a funding call out, and I know everybody says, don't change the funding, just have ideas, but sometimes we need money, right?
Yeah.
There's this funding call out that was for Bradford-based artists who had to kind of develop performance work, and I'd never done that. And I was like, well, worth a go.
Yeah.
I could say this out loud. And it was kind of that excitement of there being opportunities here where I live.
Yeah.
And I know we have this excellent cultural officer at Bradford Castle now called Phil Hargreaves, and one of the things he spoke about was, like, in his creative career, he didn't earn any money in the Bradford district. He earned all his money elsewhere. What he really wants to do is make it so that people who live here can earn money here.
Yeah, yeah. Because that's the thing, isn't it? You know, these conversations here we're having, me talking to you as an individual artist, you know, they shouldn't be perceived completely in isolation, in that, like, you're, you know, supporting your work has an impact in where you live, like, and it connects with other people, and, you know, on a purely capitalist, you know, way of presenting that, you know, it's like you say, there's money to be spent in your area in that way, and yeah, that shouldn't be forgotten about in terms of, like, the kind of interconnectedness of that, and not just being individuals, but yeah, I think so that are you feeling a sense of does, like, has the novelty, does it still feel novel that there's stuff happening in that way, or and do you feel hopeful that can have a legacy beyond the cultural year that Bradford's coming up to being?
I really hope so. I really hope it can, and I really hope that it's used as an opportunity to foster the talent that I know is here.
Yeah.
But I also have a mindset, which I think a lot of people locally also have, of just, like, wanting to grab it while it's happening and make the most of it. I think there's a lot of really interesting grassroots things starting to happen. So I've been involved with an organisation called Keithley Creative, who are based in Keithley, and I'd really like to see them flourish and providing opportunities. And it's kind of an if you build it, they will come thing, right? This area has been technically a cultural desert in Keithley, which I hate.
Yeah. Like, because you said it there, like, you want to be able to, like, make that thrive for the people that are here, because this is like the whole kind of motivation behind this project is to find people in a way that doesn't discover them. Like, I want to meet them, you know, I don't want to discover them, because they are already existing, they're already doing things, and I refuse to accept it. Like you say, the cultural desert is just a fallacy. Like, it's not true.
And it's like you said about giving. So I had an exhibition in the summer of 2021 with my friend Jess Kidd, and loads of people came because we know people here. And
Yeah,
there's like loads of my grandparents' friends came. So there was all these like wonderful ladies in the 70s and 80s go
amazing.
with my grandma to her like tea group. And a lot of them had never been to an exhibition before, but they were there because because they know me and they loved it. They had a great time and they're like, oh, what's happening at Keithley Creative next weekend?
Yeah. And I guess that's a really exciting way of again just kind of like constantly being able to zoom out of these kind of individual conversations and thinking about how offering space for doing something a bit different for artists that are approaching things a bit differently. It's that kind of, not only does that support the artist, but also like the kind of, if you think of diverse audiences, diverse creative audiences like that, and I don't think that would be a primary audience reach in central city spaces. I don't think that would be, and that's a real missed opportunity, isn't it?
Yes, because you have that opportunity. I think one of the things you have, I really felt it around, not that we want to go into this, but around the conversation about Brexit, of a lot of my friends who lived in big cities had that echo chamber feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I was really interested in about Keighley was Keighley had the exact same split as the national split.
Oh, interesting.
But I felt really different about Brexit to what my friends who lived in cities felt, because I was interacting with people on both sides of the debate regularly.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that, I mean, I was very upset about it, I'm not going to lie, but I felt like I expected it more than maybe like my friends who were living in cities.
Yeah. And do you think that those conversations were in general just more accessible to have do you think that people, that was sort of,
I would say inescapable, inaccessible. It was just kind of inevitable.
yeah,
Everybody was talking about it.
yeah,
And that's I did a series for disability arts called Why Would You Live Here, which I kind of wrote in the aftermath of the 2019 election, because I felt like one of the things that made me really angry was there was this thing about a particular profile of men who watch rugby league that I really disagree. And there's a assumption that men who watch rugby league in towns like Keighley are going to have maybe, I'm going to use the word, old-fashioned views,
right,
likely to feel left behind by the sort of liberal agenda or whatever you want to call it. And that made me really angry because I know a lot of men who watch rugby league and aren't like that.
yeah,
And kind of to illustrate the point, Keighley Cougars, who are the rugby league team who are based here, have become the first rugby league team to have an official Pride event and are really involved with like LGBTQ rights.
yeah.
And I think that's just something that people don't imagine.
No, that's amazing.
And it comes about because the people who own the club, their son is gay. So it's it's that same thing of people have connections that people don't imagine, and people love people.
And it's that same kind of elitist approach, isn't it, of just like that, yeah, culture and culture just doesn't get to exist in the way it freely does for some people, I should say, in city spaces, in that way, that kind of claim to those kinds of those kinds of expressions of and support networks and things like that. I think I think that's that. When I think about like the narrative of rural spaces like that, it is very much a kind of this really rigid perception mainly from people who don't live there. I guess maybe just before we move on, could you tell me a little bit more about like I couldn't remember the name, Keighley Creatives, is that right?
Creative, yeah.
Keithley Creatives. Yeah, could you maybe tell me a little bit more about like how you feel as a disabled artist, how you feel like that is like building not just a scene that has opportunities for you in your local area, but also like things that feel remotely accessible to you. Is that happening? Do you feel like there is accessible stuff going on that feels connecting with you?
I think there is a real there's a real wanting things to be accessible, but there's all everything's underfunded and under resourced, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's an organization that used temporary building space,
Right.
and the space we used to be in had level access on both floors, and the new space is much less accessible. And I know that there's a lot of sadness about that, especially from me, but like from the people involved as well. But it's kind of part of the reality, which I think in a broader context does come up for disabled artists, of when we're a lot of art spaces, because there's hardly any money, end up being in temporary buildings.
Yeah.
Accessibility can end up being the thing that is sacrificed, because we're in a temporary space and it's a building that was built in the 1960s. So I think it is quite interesting. I know there is a lot of I can't think of the right word, but there's a lot of will and a lot of wanting it to, but unless we can get a building that is accessible, they're just not the resources. And I think that's part of the downside of these like wonderful grassroots movements, is that there's not money. And one of the things that I often feel like is, look at what, like, all this wonderful stuff that they've built at Keithley Creative with hardly any resources. Like, give them stuff and see, like, what would these same people do if you gave them like a huge budget? I know there was a lot of controversy in the last Arts Council funding thing about opera getting the budget cut. Let's give it to organizations like Keithley Creative and just see what they would build, because I really believe in the power of the arts to have a regenerative effect on towns like Keighley that have suffered a certain level of post-industrial decline, of being the thing that gets people going back into town again, giving people a reason to be there. And artists want studios, and we want these huge empty buildings, have former shopping centres. So let's make that happen.
Yeah, definitely. And are you like, do you, I mean, you just described, and this isn't, you don't have to talk about this if you don't want to, but like, you've just moved back into, you've just said you set up your studio space, which you're sat in now. Are you able to, like, how do you feel about that? Does that feel like it's kind of just how it is, and that's the nature of it at the moment? Or what does that feel for you? Is it,
there was a lot of mixed emotions for me, for sure, because I felt really excited to be back in a community again, and in there's such a nice feeling of being around other artists and that kind of serendipitous, just bumping into somebody and having a chat. And I am going to really miss that. But also I feel really good about it's actually a thing that I learned from watching the artist Abby Palmer on Instagram. She spoke about adapt when your disability changes. So she was talking about her own experience. She does use she/her pronouns, doesn't she?
Yeah, she does. Yeah,
that's fine. Checking that. So she was talking about her own experience of kind of learning when her condition flares up to sort of give up the hope that you're going to get better quite quickly and focus on what can I do right now to be able to make the things that make me feel like a person and an artist.
Yeah.
And that's a lot healthier, because like hoping you're going to get better can become really toxic for you. I had that in my head when I had this most recent flare up of my condition, of like, well, I just need to make it so that I can make work on my worst day. And that's going to be less painful. The thing that was really painful for me was renting a space that I couldn't get into. And all the time that I was going to be able, maybe next week I'll feel well enough to get in. And it wasn't, there was barriers once I got to the building, but there was also the barriers of I couldn't get on the bus at the moment. So there was kind of a lot before you even got as far as the stairs that I couldn't get up. So it was definitely that feeling of like, what can I do right now that's going to make this work? And I feel really lucky, that I do live in a house with a spare room that I could turn into a studio.
Yeah.
And when I was a teenager, I was really interested in the art of the Bloomsbury group. I think partially, I'm sort of excited by their queer lifestyle.
Yeah.
But so I've sort of been thinking about that again, about that idea of really investing, because they had famously Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell had Charleston House, which they worked in. They were both painters as their home studio, but they also like painted all the furniture and made it like this really wonderful space. And that idea of, I've just kind of become interested now in like artistic nesting, the idea of like artists really investing in our creative space and kind of what can you do from home. And I'm quite interested in, I've kind of been doing some iPad doodles of like, because suddenly if you're just doing things virtually, things become really possible. So like if you've always wanted to do a painting on a ceiling and you can't do it, but you can take a photograph and do an iPad drawing on the ceiling, there's quite exciting stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, definitely. I wonder if like and thank you, I appreciated your vulnerability in answering that question, because it is a really hard process to kind of like adapt to essentially an unmet access need, to whilst also appreciating the nature of how something like that comes about. I wonder if there's anything that you think you might consider in the future, having had such a positive experience with Keighley Creatives, in terms of the actual, creative network available that is there, and they're joining people together and facilitating that kind of meeting point of artists in the area. Do you think that there's potential for that to reach all the way from that inaccessible building over there in Keighley to your sofa? Do you think there's a way of making that happen that would facilitate that?
For sure. I think they're a really nice group of people at Keighley Creative, and there's a real, these are a group of people who are like, we need a studio, let's ask if we can do it in an empty shopping centre. And there's kind of, they've made a lot happen with not a lot of resources. And I'm still quite in touch with them, and I think there would potentially be an opportunity for like, is there, like you said, like a Zoom drop that you could do or something like that. And I think they're quite open to working on that with me and finding ways of keeping me and other people who can't access
because it's not just you, right? It'll be someone else too. It'll be multiple other people that would that had, for lots of different reasons, find different things inaccessible. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's that being able to translate that will that is there, that desire to want to meet you where you're at, and translate that into something that is then possible, that still kind of nourishes that creative connection that quite clearly is happening there,
Yes, and I definitely think that there's a lot of hope for, because it is a temporary building, a lot of hope for eventually finding a permanent building that is accessible. So and they're very much including me in that conversation
Nice.
as kind of because I think it feels like a real community to me.
Oh, that's amazing. And this is a thing as well in terms of like what being able to kind of like commit to ways in which you can still be included and be a part of that scene and that space. Like surely that only supports the somewhat fragility of their own circumstances, in that it's a temporary space that they exist in, and who knows where the next space will be, how long another space might be available for, and so like being able to try and to like think differently, the joy of access.
Yes.
Being able to kind of try and adapt in a way that is beyond a physical location is surely benefits everybody, including the organization.
I really like that phrase you used, the joy of access, because I think that's a really good way of thinking about it, rather than like, we have to, all this extra stuff we have to do.
Yeah.
I've been really interested to see the Bronte Parsonage run the Bronte Women's Writing Festival. They have kind of really wholeheartedly embraced hybrid events.
Wow, that's great.
And I partially, having spoken to them about it, partially that is this kind of acknowledgement that actually Howard's in the middle of nowhere and hard to get to.
Yeah.
And we have this huge global audience.
Mm-hmm.
And we can get, people from New York streaming into Howard online. And I think that is a thing of, it's like a double, because it's access, there's still a lot of people who can't be in person for COVID reasons, or just all the things that were stopping us being in person before COVID.
Yeah.
But also it is like, it's a real opportunity as well, and you can do such cool things. I have this idea that I probably will never develop, but I had through Zoom, of like, you could do a really that I had through the COVID era, peak COVID. How good would a Zoom-based murder mystery be?
Oh yeah,
You can have really cool. Like on-screen view, and like stuff's happening in the background of people's videos. You really don't notice. That's a clue.
But this is the thing though, like I was part of a panel event that Level put on, an amazing symposium event produced by at Level, and Katie Walters, who was another artistic associate when I was there as well. And they produced this really brilliant day called titled Housebound, and it was exploring performance art through virtual screenings. And what was really exciting as part of those conversations around it was talking about, again, not only is this an access point, but this is like exploring a whole under kind of explored medium, that this is not like a watered down version of a live event. This is a different medium that we're kind of working with here, and like what's possible within that. And I think that's why like using a term like the joy of access is really important, because people think about access as being something that's this really like dry bullet point list, and it's like, no, it's this amazing dynamic thing that is a conversation between people, and again about discovering what is possible with an ambition,
Yes, for sure. And I think that's a very good point, that we're kind of, there's a little bit of backlash at the minute, because people are so excited to see people from the shoulders down.
Yeah.
But genuinely there is all this, like, it's a new frontier, and there's all this stuff that we don't know about yet. There's this cool creative potential. I went to a storytelling event where it was live streamed from Norway, and the artist had made these like sound card clips that was like a and she said in it, her ideal circumstance would be that you listen to it while touching a tree.
Oh, amazing.
And I was like, that's so cool. And that's what we can do with the internet, of this kind of third space.
Yeah.
And I think we don't this is a really nerdy thing, but I'm really fascinated that it was kind of the plague that ended traditional feudalism in Britain and across Europe
Mm.
because so many people had died at that time that forcing people, people could just leave and go and work somewhere else for the first time. And it created a system where people began to be paid. Right? Like, it still wasn't great, but it was better than what had happened before. And I think that there's going to be changes in society that we don't fully understand because of the COVID pandemic in the same way. And one of them is that you cannot put the genie of remote working back in the bottle, even though they're kind of really pushing it at the minute, because there is this backlash.
Yeah.
Of so many, like, because that's the thing, that there's access for all kinds of different reasons, but there's also like people who just enjoy going to events and being able to keep their pajama bottoms on.
Yeah, totally. This is it, and it's that kind of sense of it being like, you can't put it back in the bottle, and nor should we stand by and let that happen, because we all need this. This is needed, and it's a benefit to everybody. Yeah, I think we can hope and dream that this can. I mean, just look at this, the magic of this today. You and I sat in the same space, and the ease of this conversation happening right now is just, that is a wonder, and I'm really grateful for it. So
Hooray!
Yay! maybe we can finish up. We're just coming to the end of our time, and I guess I'll just kind of leave it open to you if there was anything you wanted to particularly share about Haworth that you want the world to know about, where not necessarily particularly related to Bronte's pets, although we know your knowledge on that is vast and world renowned. But is there anything you wanted to, more about your experience with Keithley Creatives, or if there's anything you just wanted to share about where you're at the moment and what's inspiring your work?
I don't know, I think I'm just partially, I feel like I have no control either over what comes out of my mouth when I'm speaking, or which is something that I've come to embrace as I've got older. I used to get really like anxious about, what am I going to make work about? What's the right thing to make work about? Should it be more? But it's like, it's just going to be what it's going to be. And I think whatever I make and whatever I'm doing, this place influences it, and it's gonna come out. And definitely, as I said, I definitely think kind of the sense of humor, which I've also spent quite a long time trying to not put in my work, but just creeps in anyway.
Yeah,
it's very much, that's what I think is a really beautiful thing about this area, that people will talk to you whatever you're doing and make jokes. And I just think it's there's a beautiful opportunity wherever you're going to experience it for what it is rather than for what you imagine it will be. And I think, because we're all tourists somewhere.
Yeah.
So let's try and embrace that when we go to places of kind of an openness to the place we're in.
Wow, that's so beautiful, because I think it's such a clear sense for me in terms of how my making is influenced by my body, the limitations of my body, the experience of illness and disability, like it's sculpted and formed, and that making is pushed through that lens. That's how it emerges. And I think it'd be really lovely to be able to kind of consider place amongst that sculpting too, in a bit more of a conscious way. I think that's, you've captured that really beautifully. Nice. Sorry, you go.
I've really enjoyed chatting. It's been wonderful.
Oh, Letty, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been just smiles all afternoon. It's been really lovely, and thank you so much for your generosity and some of the vulnerability of the questions as well. It's really appreciated. And thank you so much for being a part of this series.